Welcome to the first episode of Season 2 of We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling, where I give you the tools and skills you need to love better so you, my friend, can live better. Anxiety is the epidemic of our time. It is the most prevalent mental health condition in the United States, affecting 1 in 3 of us at some point in our life, according to the National Institute of Mental Health. For many, it's more than just a momentary feeling of nervousness. It is an all-consuming cycle of worry and fear that can upend careers, relationships, and our ability to perform the most basic daily tasks. Anxiety has become so common that you might think of it as being inevitable, like it's just the price we pay for living in our neurotically fast-paced, hyper-connected world. But what if there was a way to break free? A way to disrupt the pattern of thought and behavior that fuels anxiety? And what if that solve wasn't rooted in some quick fix, but in evidence-based science? Today, I'm sitting down with Dr. Jud Brewer, a psychiatrist and neuroscientist who has dedicated his entire career to understanding the mechanics of anxiety and helping people loosen its grip. Dr. Jud's groundbreaking work connects the dots between our brain's habit loops and the anxiety that can feel so unshakable. From his New York Times best-selling book, Unwinding Anxiety, to his evidence-based digital tools, Dr. Jud offers a roadmap to not only manage anxiety, but to transform our relationship with it entirely. If anxiety has ever held you back, or if you know someone who struggles with it, this should be mandatory listening or viewing if you're watching it on YouTube. So let's welcome Dr. Jud Brewer, and I will do my best to dial down my inner fangirl, though just between the two of us, I will be losing it this entire episode. Does everyone experience anxiety? What's the difference between experiencing it normally and experiencing it at a level that it would that you would be diagnosed with anxiety?
Anxiety is something that we can learn to work with, and it's something that's probably come as an evolutionary bottleneck, interestingly, between like fear, which is really helpful, and planning, which is really helpful. But when those two, you think mixing two good things together, you're going to get two great things. Unfortunately, our brain whiffed on that one. So, it's like the fear of the future. That's where anxiety comes in. Not so helpful. And we can dig in. There are lots of myths around that. Lots of books written about how you can, this Yerkes-Dodson curve and, performance anxiety, all that. I think of that as internet myth number 2. Number 1 that makes me cringe the most is that dopamine is a happiness molecule. So, yeah.
Do you want to just clarify what dopamine is then?
Oh, sure. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's involved in reinforcement learning. So it fires when we need to learn something. And actually, this is somewhat related to anxiety, but it fires to help us learn, and then it fires in anticipation of doing something. So, for example, our ancient ancestors needed to remember where food was. So when they were out foraging and found a source of food, they would eat the food, and then their stomach would fire off this cascade that resulted in dopamine firing in their brain that basically said, remember what you ate and where you found it. So it's this way to lay down what's called, context-dependent memory. And in fact, this process is evolutionarily conserved all the way back to the sea slug. 20,000 neurons, learns the same way that humans do in this way through positive and negative reinforcement. In fact, Eric Kandel got the Nobel Prize back in 2000 showing that was the case. So very important and very evolutionarily conserved process. That's what dopamine does. So when we learn something, dopamine fires, but it's only right at the beginning. So like when something surprises us, like, oh, whether it's a happy surprise. So imagine, you come home from work and your partner's like organized a surprise party. Some people are like, oh, that's great. Some people are like, oh, I'm going to kill you. I hate surprises, But either way, it's surprising. And that surprise, that feeling of, oh, that contracted quality of experience is actually a marker that dopamine is just fired that says, hey, remember this. We lay down emotion laden memories or emotional memories. So then dopamine fires in anticipation of that thing. So,
Huh.
yeah. So I'll
And
just say,
how does
yeah.
it make us feel?
Well, it's designed to make us do things. It's a motivation molecule. So it makes us feel contracted, itchy, urgy. This is where cravings are a great example of dopamine firing, where we learn, that we like chocolate or something. And then when we think of chocolate, we get that urge to go get the chocolate. That urge is dopamine firing in anticipation. Notice how pleasure is not part of that equation. Dopamine's not set up to be a pleasure molecule. Because if we were pleasurable, we'd be like, chocolate, yeah, don't really need it. I feel pretty good. If it fired when we thought about chocolate in a way that was pleasurable. So that's internet myth number one, an aside, but an important one.
And so it sounds to me like what you're saying, we're all hardwired to experience anxiety and that it's not necessarily a pathology, a problem. At some point, it does become a problem. What's the tipping point?
Yes. So I haven't met anyone that has never felt anxiety, right? And part of that is that we all feel fear. It's a very helpful survival mechanism. And, we all plan for the future. We know how to do that. And so our brains are kind of wired. And then when those two wires get crossed, where we're fearful of the future, we're afraid of the future, that's where anxiety comes in. Now, it only becomes a problem when when it gets in the way. So sometimes we have a little bit of anxiety of the future and then we can let it go. And most people fall on the spectrum between some people are just so chill that they just, they're afraid when they need to be and that goes away. And they plan when they need to plan. And those two never get wired together. Other people at the far end of the spectrum, they're constantly worrying. I've had tons of patients with generalized anxiety disorder who wake up in the morning feeling anxious. They worry all day, which just keeps driving that anxiety. They go to sleep or they try to sleep because it also keeps them
Yeah.
awake. Next day, rinse and repeat. So they're the two ends of the spectrum. Most of us, lie somewhere in some bell curve in the middle where, some people get anxious, worried about the future for some period of time, but it doesn't drive them and it doesn't last all day. So, anybody can ask, well, when have I felt anxious? Most people can say, oh, I felt anxious here, here, here. And then what drives that? Like, how long does it stick around? And how long it sticks around is really going to be a key factor in what causes problems for us, and then what even leads to some people being diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. I don't like the term disorder, in general. I think, in terms of conditions, mostly these are set up for billing for medical purposes. So just for the record, I like to think of, the one condition that I think we all have is called the human condition.
Hmm.
And it's not pathology. It's really the more we can learn how our brains work, the more we can learn to befriend them and work with them. And then it's not as much of a problem. And that's, I think that's a more hopeful view and one way that, I truly, truly see the world. I'm not just being Pollyannish about this.
No, I can feel that you come from a strengths-based perspective and that you try to depathologize things and explain them in a way that this is all just part of being human.
Hmm.
However, I'm going to push back here because,
Please.
anxiety is the most prevalent mental health concern that we have right now. It is the mental health condition of our time. Do you
Hmm.
think our lifestyle, at least in America, contributes to the rates of anxiety that we're seeing? And if so, in what ways?
Yeah. So 100% I agree. And I think there are a lot of modern, let's say, amenities or technologies that contribute to it directly. So, for example, so let's get at the mechanism, right? anxiety is really about uncertainty,
Mhm.
and our brains are wired to reduce uncertainty. Yet that's really about the present moment. So imagine, again, ancient ancestors, they're in the cave, they hear some rustling outside in the bushes. You know, if dopamine fires and it's a pleasure molecule, they're like, whatever, rustling in the bushes, then the saber-toothed tiger comes in and eats them for lunch, right? Not a
Mhm.
very good survival mechanism. But if that uncertainty says, hey, you better go figure out if that's your brother, out there going to the bathroom or a saber-toothed tiger, then you can act accordingly. If it's your brother, you're like, hey, don't scare me. And if it's the saber-toothed tiger, you can fight it off or run or do whatever you need to do. So uncertainty is the key aspect here. So if we get, if that uncertainty drives us to do something in the present moment, it's very helpful for survival. Yet if it's uncertainty about the future, that's a problem because we can plan for the future, but we can't act on the future right now because it's the
Mhm.
future, right? So what does modern day have to do with that? And what do the modern day circumstances and technologies, how do they play into that? Well, think of information is like food for our brain, right? When
Mhm.
we're hungry, our stomach fires dopamine signaling that says, go get some food. And in the same way, and people have done studies showing that this is, actually dopaminergically mediated, that in primates, they'll actually forego nutrient like drink and juice. They'll forego nutrient for information. So
Huh.
that's how important information is for survival, right? And people have shown this in experimental settings. So think about information and all the information that's available to us in modern day, right?
In our information age that we're living in.
Yes. It's more than we could ever consume.
Mhm.
Okay. So lots of information, it's readily available. So back in the day when I was a paper boy growing up, and I delivered first afternoon papers and then morning papers, when I got promoted to the morning route. So people could read the news twice a day and they could watch the news at like noon and I guess, morning news, noon news, and evening news. That's all that was on. And then it was the
Mhm.
soap operas or whatever. So now, very different. We have news feeds. All the news sources are digitized. And so we have a constant scroll. So you can get tons of information all the time. On top of that, we, we also have misinformation and disinformation. So, back in the day, you saw a saber-toothed tiger, you weren't like, is that a deep fake? you know, you,
Right.
you
You
didn't have
weren't
to,
questioning, you weren't questioning the source, you weren't questioning
right,
your eyes,
right,
you were very clear that there was a threat in front of you and you have to act accordingly. You have three choices,
exactly.
basically.
So now, not only do we have more information than we can ever consume that is always available, we now have to figure out if it's real or not. That's a lot of uncertainty. No wonder everybody's anxious.
And what do you think about our sedentary lifestyle? This sounds so random, but I recently got a desk riser, so that my computer can rise with me when I'm in sessions. I'm a full-time clinician. I
Mhm.
see, I don't know, anywhere between 4 and 7 clients a day. And I wear a wearable, whether it's a watch, a ring, our wearables will often give us biohack try in our effort to try and biohack ourselves and live longer than we're supposed to live, which you and I are certainly, we are living longer than ancient humans lived. I will get readings that say I'm not active enough. And so in getting this desk riser, I can now go up and down, which I won't do for you now because I have a second camera set up to get a perfect shot of my side. But I can go up and down without disrupting my clients. And I have found that for me, the vibrational frequency that I live in, it's really beneficial in lowering my stress, which
Mhm.
which to me points towards, and of course, before COVID and certainly during COVID, we've all been inundated with the feedback that like sitting is the new smoking. It's
Mm,
so bad for us. So I'm wondering, to what extent do you attribute such a sedentary lifestyle? I realize that we're not all service providers and people who make a living by thinking. Some of us do. You and I
mhm,
think more than we probably actually do.
mhm.
Um, to what extent do you think that contributes to the rise in anxiety that we're seeing?
I'm sure it doesn't help. Let's put it that way. There's a safe answer. And I'll just say personally, it's interesting you mentioned the desk riser. I've had a rising desk for a while. And even then, sometime during the pandemic, I got a treadmill that I could put under the desk. And for me, that was a game changer because I would notice that I would fidget and I would have to change posture standing. Yet there's something very natural about walking. And
Yes.
so if it's just at a conversational pace where I'm not bobbing up and down and distracting, if I'm on with a patient or on a meeting, it's just I can be pretty, it looks like I'm moving a little bit, but it doesn't look like I'm running or something,
Right.
And there's something very natural about the simple act of walking. In fact,
Hmm.
Charles Darwin had a contemplation path in his backyard. I don't know if you knew that.
I did not.
Yeah. So that dude, as he was, he had the long beard, so I can imagine him like stroking his long beard going, what is it about that Bluefoot booby? Like, what is it? What is it? And so it's not like he was doing internet searches to try to figure out what his data meant, where he eventually comes up with this idea of evolution. He was contemplating, and I think that's very natural for humans to be in movement, not necessarily
Mm.
running all the time, but in movement. So absolutely, sitting definitely not helpful.
Because I've also often made sense of anxiety in this overly simplistic way, as if it's like for some of us, there's just an abundance of energy.
Oh yeah,
And if
absolutely.
we're not getting it out, because I have ADHD, underscore, circle, and highlight the H part. The hyperactivity part for me is quite significant. I've had it I've had it my whole life. I've been medicated and managed for more than half my life. So at this point, it's not as obvious to clients. What is
Mhm.
probably more obvious to colleagues and clients is the rigidity with which I work. And those are the behavioral modifications that I've employed to compensate for the ADHD. But the
Mhm.
H aspect of it, and you don't necessarily need the H aspect of it to have what I see as an abundance of energy in some people who present with moderate to significant. Hello, Cad.
All right, Zoom mom
Dr.
time.
Judd. Sorry, Dr. Judd's black, beautiful boy cat just jumped on him. And this is like, I can feel my whole nervous system just settling,
Yeah,
just
really
seeing
good.
that. That's so beautiful. So I've often conceptualized of anxiety as like this abundance of energy. Is there any legitimacy to that, or is that just a weird Darcyism?
Uh, I'm sure there's something to that in the sense that, when we are just confining ourselves and not letting our bodies move the way they naturally want to, it's not helpful.
Right. Are there some ways that anxiety shows up that are less obvious for people? Like we all know that anxiety, we know the stereotypical presentation of anxiety, which is like pressured speech,
Mm.
jumpiness, maybe feeling incapacitated to make a decision, worrying, pacing. But are there some less known ways that anxiety can present?
I would say, and I can speak to this personally, sometimes it can show up in our body to the point where it's kind of screaming at us. So, for example, when I was in college, and I wrote about this in my Unwinding Anxiety book, I didn't know it at the time, but I had irritable bowel syndrome.
Mm,
And I remember I did a lot of backpacking at the time. So I thought I had this parasite, from not getting my water filtered well,
mm-hmm.
giardia. So I went to student health and I asked, the doc, I was like, I think I have giardia. And he's like, did the test and whatever. And he's like, could you be stressed or anxious? And I was like, no way, I'm not, I'm vegetarian. I run, I play the violin, blah, blah. And he's like, okay. I was in total denial. And I just could never imagine that, why would I get anxiety? Well, anybody can. And so for me, it showed up as irritable bowel syndrome. And when I
Hmm.
started working, with I actually started meditating. This is at the beginning of medical school, and then it went away. And so there was really good. It's not like medical school's calming, you
Right, for
know.
sure.
So it was really me learning to work with my mind. So I could see a direct connection, and that's there's pretty good evidence that stress and anxiety are big contributors to IBS. So there's one way that it can show up, which is not the worrying piece, but really through the body.
Hmm. I love that you referenced irritable bowel syndrome because the first word of that term is one that I often miss as anxiety. Sometimes people will present as being very irritable. I will. That's how it
Hmm.
shows up in me. I'm
Hmm.
short. Um, and I hear the tone in my voice and I'm like, what is going on with me?
Yeah.
Because I'm not a naturally irritable person. I'm one of the lucky ones who was born with a predisposition to be happy. So, all evidence to the contrary to those of you who know me personally and professionally. I do have there's no excuse except that's how anxiety can present in me. Do you see that clinically as well?
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know, I have experienced with my patients how anxiety can carry so much shame. And I can't help but imagine that shame, I've experienced it with them, that it's not helpful. So I'm curious what people can do to diminish the shame and why do we tend to feel shame? It creates a secondary concern. First,
Mhm.
we've got the anxiety, like that's not bad enough, and then we're embarrassed over it, which I don't
Yeah.
know that animals experience. Like they just have the primary emotion and they don't have the secondary judgment about the primary emotion. So what think you?
Yeah. Well, despite how people like to anthropomorphize their pets, where, it's certainly seen, dogs and cats look kind of ashamed when their owner scolds them. And I always wonder who owns whom, but anyway, the,
Literally.
yeah, the shame I think is really important to explore because often we think, and I see this not just with people with anxiety, but with anytime somebody feels like they can't control their mind or break a bad habit. So I see this a lot with people who are struggling with like clinical obesity or some, at an unhealthy weight, and they join some weight loss program and then they don't, it's not successful, and then the weight loss program says, well, here's the formula, you just didn't follow the formula. There's something implied that there's
Hmm.
something wrong with that person, when in fact these all of these programs, every single one, is built on the myth of willpower.
Right.
And so the same is true with anxiety, where someone's like, just get it together, stop worrying, just relax. And they feel like, oh, there's something wrong with me if I can't control my mind. Well, there's nothing wrong with them. It's just that they don't know how their mind works. And on top of it, the shame spiral gets going, guilt and shame. They feel guilty because they can't change the behavior, and then they feel ashamed of themselves. And the
Right.
problem is that feels like it's doing something. Oh, I can at least beat myself up or feel ashamed. And that gets driven through the same habit cycle as anxiety itself. So they feed on each other.
So the shame becomes a fuel source for more anxiety
Yeah,
because it's
absolutely.
another thing to be preoccupied with and concerned about. That is such a double bind. That's terrible.
I know.
That's very bleak.
Well,
Very bleak.
it's bleak if we don't know how our brains work, and then not so much if we know how to work with them because we can use the same mechanisms to work with them. So that, it's good news. It's simple, and it's not something you have to buy. It's something that we all have.
Right. The innate ability to understand how our minds work.
Hmm.
How effective are the most effective anti-anxiety medications?
There's what's called a number needed to treat, which is a fancy scientific term. I love it. Scientists and we clinicians come up with these fancy terms so we can sound smart. Well, really, all that means is like if you gave X number of people a medication, how many people would you have to give the medication to before one showed a significant benefit?
Mm-hmm.
And with the best anti-anxiety medications out there, that number, it's called a number needed to treat, is 5.2, which means 1 in 5 people.
Now that's bleak.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah, they
I
haven't
mean,
exactly nailed it with medications. I say that as somebody that prescribes medications,
for
not in
sure.
place.
And thankfully you have evidence-based treatments for anxiety, which we will absolutely dive into real soon, that are far more, I mean, and I will talk more about this when we're in it. But I have found them to be so much more effective and reliable, some of your programs than anti-anxiety meds. And by the way, nobody wants to go on them. Nobody
Yeah.
wants to go on them. They come with a host of side effects. And then when and how do you off ramp them? But more to the efficacy or lack thereof of medications, is it true that doing cardio is more effective than the most effective anti-anxiety medications?
Oh, I haven't seen that head-to-head trial. I think what I've seen is that it's at least as effective as, like they call this behavioral activation or something like that,
Hmm.
that it's very effective, right, on a population level. But I haven't seen any head-to-head trials. That would be very interesting to see.
And it's interesting that you were doing that organically in med school, which you didn't think was going to be super stressful or anxiety provoking. But weren't you also getting a PhD at the same time? Or
Yeah.
did what? Yeah, I mean, I can't. Like literally, why do I feel a little stressed as if med school isn't enough? Um, Okay, so I stumbled on your course, Unwinding Anxiety, when I was searching for evidence-based tools for a client. And as it turns out, there aren't many.
Yeah.
Is it surprising to you, which I'm grateful for in a way because it made finding the right tools so much easier, but is it surprising to you how few tools there are for anxiety, given that it's the most prevalent mental health issue of our time?
Yes, a little surprising. When I got into this, and I stumbled into this when I was struggling helping my own patients. So, early in my career, 1 in 5 of my patients was showing a significant reduction in anxiety. And so I was playing the medication lottery, talk about uncertainty, because I didn't know which one was going to benefit and what to do with the other four. That's
Right.
just if I only saw 5. So just multiply that by a lot more. So
Mm-hmm.
I started, and I was doing habit change research at the time. We were doing work with smoking cessation and overeating and finding that, we could apply some of these methodologies to good effect. Like we'd gotten in a randomized controlled trial, we'd gotten 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment for smoking cessation. So we're like, okay, this works pretty well. So one of my patients, where we developed this program for eating, and I talk about it in my hunger habit book, but basically we had helped them start to learn how their habits around eating were eating them, so to speak. And one of them
Mm.
said, "Hey, anxiety is driving me to stress eat. Can you create a program for anxiety?" And I was thinking, well, I prescribe medications. And I was like, well, these medications don't work that well. So
One
I
in
went,
five.
yeah. So I went back and looked at the literature. And it turns out that back in the 1980s, this guy, Thomas Borkovic, had proposed that anxiety could be driven like a habit. And I say 1980s because that's significant historically, because that's when Prozac came out and everybody's like, oh, miracle drug. All depression and anxiety is going to be solved.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now there was a big study in the UK showing that the SSRIs are no better than placebo. So there was a lot of hype that I think drove a lot of the effect. And this is common for medications in general. It's not like they're special, but they, not they haven't delivered what they promised. So this thing got buried, and then I'm struggling, and I find the study, and I'm like, wow, this is great because I know something about how to apply habit change methodology, and wow, let's
Mm-hmm.
apply this to anxiety. So that's where things got rolling for me, just because, necessity is the mother of invention. And like, I needed to find some better way to help my patients.
Right. Nobody ever sets out, I don't think in our field, anyone who's actually credentialed in our field, none of us actually set out to come up with program. We don't become clinicians or service or healthcare providers to do program development. We do it because there's nothing available. There's a hole and a need, and we're having a rinse and repeat in our clinical practice of a presentation of a problem for which there is, and it's like you can only, how many times can you hear yourself give the same 10 lectures before you say, maybe I should put this to tape,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, totally. Totally.
Your program focuses on identifying and breaking the feedback loop of anxiety. Can you
Mhm.
explain what that loop is and how mindfulness disrupts it, please?
So this is what Barkovec suggested. He suggested that anxiety could drive the mental behavior of worrying. I'm going to repeat that because this is critical, and this was not something I learned in medical school or residency. Anxiety can trigger the mental behavior of worrying. And the reason that that's, might sound obvious to people that worry, but it's not obvious to a lot of people because we often think of behavior as something that we do that you can observe externally. So, I'm anxious, so I eat. I'm anxious, so I smoke a cigarette. I'm anxious, so I scroll on my social media or my news feed, which of course makes me more anxious. So,
Right.
worrying is this internal behavior. And it's interesting because the feeling of worry, which is part of the definition of anxiety, can drive the mental behavior of worrying. So those two just feed off of each other. It becomes
Mm-hmm.
this feeding frenzy. We feel worried, we start to worry. We worry, so we feel more worried. We feel more worried, so we worry more.
And I don't think many people contemplate the idea that a behavior can be internal. It
Right.
can be a thought process. I mean, if you
Mhm.
just think about OCD, it's a ritual of thinking. I mean, the thought component to it, aside from setting aside the behavior that we see oftentimes, there's a rumination of thought. There's a looping of or certain sequencing of thought, which is very much a behavior.
Absolutely. Right. So that's one of the key ahas here. And the other is that these two just, feed on each other and become this vicious habit loop. So, how does it become a habit loop? Well, for
Hmm.
any behavior to become a habit, it has to have some rewarding element at some point. Okay. So, what the research has shown is that the mental behavior of worrying often makes people feel like they're in control. And
Hmm. It feels protective.
yes, yeah. So the key here is feeling like they're in control.
Right.
Because when you look at it, worrying doesn't actually give us any more control than when we don't worry, because it's about the future. And we can plan for the future, but that doesn't give us control over the future. It's just planning. On top of that, when we worry, we're not actually planning, we're not problem solving. We're actually just getting stuck in a rut where our brain can't actually think and plan clearly. We're,
Hmm.
we're stuck, we're worried, And so if that's what perseveration is all about, perseveration is where we're stuck in a rut. We're not thinking anything new. We're not open to new possibilities. We're just stuck in that rut. So at first, it can feel, that doing something feels better than doing nothing. And it's only when we start to realize that the doing something is actually doing nothing for us in terms of making our lives worse. That's where we can start to work with it. And that's how we set up this program to help people break free from that cycle.
And how does mindfulness play into that? What role does it have?
It plays a critical role. And I like, more and more, I'm abandoning the word mindfulness because it's a concept and it can be confusing, or and people have different definitions. But if we look at the core elements of mindfulness, it's really this awareness of what's happening And then very importantly, this attitude of curiosity. Okay. So think of it as being curiously aware.
Mm.
So when we bring curiosity in to the moment, we can break it into 3 steps. The first step is just being curious about what the behavior is. Because if we can't recognize that we're in the habit of worrying, and habits by definition are things that happen automatically.
Hmm.
So if we're automatically in this rut of worrying, we might not even notice it. So the first step is to get curious and start becoming aware. Oh, am I worrying? Right? That oh signifies the curiosity. The second step, and this can sound counterintuitive until it's understood why it works, is to really leverage the strength of our brain, this reward-based learning in our brain, to ask ourselves the simple question, what am I getting from this? And what that question helps us do is to drop into our direct experience and identify that worrying is actually making us more anxious and it's not helping. Okay.
Hmm.
This can be challenging when people have this assumption that, well, my worrying must be helpful somehow, right? They can collect the direct evidence for themselves and ask, okay, what's it doing for me? Is it helping me plan? No, because I've already planned and now I'm just going over the same plan over and over and over and I'm worrying. Is it going to work? Is it solving problems? No. Often people think, well, when I was worrying, I had this idea. Well, if you worry all the time and you have an idea, of course you're going to correlate the two because you're worrying. But
And unfortunately, like a slot machine, which
yeah,
only hits very randomly and in a small minority of pulls, you're going to keep doing the thing because we know those of us who have studied learning understand that intermittently getting the thing you want is a
mhm.
greater teaching tool. It's more reinforcing. We're more likely to try and do that, repeat that behavior than if we consistently got rewarded for the behavior, which is so weird. It doesn't even make sense to me saying it.
Well, so the reason it makes sense is think of our brains as, I don't know, think of it as a phone, right? And our phones only have a certain amount of memory. So imagine walking around all day with your video recording, right? We're going to run out of space at some point, even if we've got the latest phone with the most memory, right? You're just going to
Hmm.
run out of space. So our brains are like that. We don't have enough literally, we don't have enough memory space to
Yeah.
record and remember everything. So our brains say, I'm going to be selective. I'm going to only record things that are important. This is where surprise comes in, right?
Yep.
So if we get a surprise, we remember those things because they're surprising. And surprise means, hey, you didn't know that before. So you might want to take a note of that. And then surprise, you'll remember it in the future. So it actually makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary perspective why we would selectively remember things, and that things that are the most emotionally charged things are the things that we're going to remember the most because
Unfortunately.
yeah, well, and those are the things that our brains say, hey, that's salient, so don't forget that. And so if it was something that was really, scary, we're going to learn that and say, don't do that again. And if it's something that's really exciting, our brain's going to say, wow, do that again. That was really fun.
We Need to Talk is sponsored by Mindful Care. You might remember my friend Dr. Tamir Aldad from a few episodes back. He just texted to let me know that Mindful Care is now accepting new patients. We all know how hard it is to find an in-network psychiatrist without a long wait list, but Mindful Care can see you same or next day for medication management, recovery, and group therapy. No wait. And they take Medicaid, Medicare, and commercial insurance. Visit mindfulcare.com or text or call 516-505-7200 to book your appointment today. Why do some people seem to get stuck in their anxiety patterns and other people are able to decide, okay, I've worried about this enough. I'm going to put it aside and focus on something else?
Mm-hmm. Great question. I don't know if there's a blanket answer to that. So my sense is that when that worrying is associated with some type of reward, that's where it's going to get locked in as a habit for somebody. That could happen. I've seen it. You've probably seen it as early as childhood. It could happen in teenagers. It could happen in adulthood. GAD, for example, tends to peak midlife. Well, there's a lot going on, raising kids, taking,
Mm-hmm.
right, taking care of parents sometimes, the sandwich generation, et cetera. So it makes a lot of sense. And so I think it's really dependent upon how people have learned to quote unquote cope in their everyday lives. And then they get stuck in those ruts or not. And also, I've seen this a lot as well. This can get passed on intergenerationally. So, when kids see their parents worrying all the time, they kind of
Mm-hmm.
internalize that and they're like, oh, they don't think this consciously, but their parents did it. And so they pick those habits up as well.
Why is OCD so resistant to treatment?
I wish I knew. I don't think anybody has a great answer to that. But I think of OCD as the kind of the far end of the spectrum of habits. Like it is such an ingrained habit that
Mm-hmm.
it is tough. I still remember even from residencies, some home visits that I did with patients with OCD where they were so locked in they could literally, adults who were wearing diapers because they couldn't leave a room because of their rituals to go to the bathroom, that type of
Wow,
thing.
that's
Yeah.
next level. That I've
Yeah.
not experienced.
Yeah, not recommended. But it's when somebody is so caught in the belief that, if I don't do this ritual the way it needs to be done, something bad will happen, right? Talk about excessive worry. Then they get locked in, and then they get these rituals don't diminish over time. They just get built upon. It's like they add a new one onto the next one, onto the next, and then it just becomes, hours long to go through these routines, all with the aim of like getting the relief of doing the routine. It's like scratching an itch. It's a
Mm-hmm.
very long itch, very long.
Yes. And sometimes it's followed by self-loathing and, judgment,
Sure.
shame, recrimination. And even though the person can register logically that it's not in their best interest to do the thing, they cannot stop. Um, so the reason it's so resistant to treatment, are we just not studying it enough?
Well, there are plenty of people studying it. I think it's what people are studying. So certainly people are looking for medications, to which, nobody's come up with a magic pill yet.
Pill.
Uh, Others are looking at the ritualized behaviors. I don't know how many people are actually looking at the reinforcement learning aspect of it, but that's a place that I would start. I just don't know
Mm.
if people are interested, have fallen into that line of research.
Yeah, there's somebody with a family member who suffers from severe OCD who's going to either get a PhD or med school, and this let this be your call to action.
Yes.
We absolutely need more research because we're all kind of shrugging when it comes to OCD.
Mhm.
Um, what are your thoughts on psychedelics in the treatment of anxiety?
It's a good question. I mean, there have been a few studies that have been done, over the last few years that are showing, these are small studies, some of them not even with good control groups, but, showing some preliminary efficacy there. And I think, and we found, when we did our first neuroimaging study of experienced meditators back in 2011, we found that the same brain networks are deactivated as when people are getting IV psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. Robin Card Harris published that first study, and literally our papers came out several, within months of each other in the same journal. It was really, really eerie. And what that suggests is that, in my interpretation of this, is that psychedelics can kind of show us what it's like to let go. And mindfulness training, for example, can teach us to do that. So I could even see them working in concert where you show somebody the path.
Right. And you
then
can
you
actually
train them.
feel the experience of, because when people are chronically anxious, they almost don't have a comparison for contrast of what it's like to be relaxed.
Yeah.
without a negative coping mechanism, often like over drinking or overusing whatever substance. And the beauty of the psychedelics, especially if you're microdosing them, and I think that as time goes on and we become more open to this field of study, we're going to hear more and more examples of this. They allow you, not only do they shut down your threat response, they shut down our amygdala a bit in the microdosing experience. And in that, you're better able to connect the dots between cause and effect, because there's no shame, there's no, the ego is quiet for a moment or for a period of time. I hadn't even thought about it in terms of, oh, it actually shows you what it's like to not feel anxious as well. But that's such a great point.
Yeah, and if we zoom in on that, the anxiety feels, and we've done studies on this, that the feeling of anxiety feels very closed down and contracted, right? Which makes sense, because if you're afraid, you're going to kind of make yourself as small of an object as possible for whatever it might be attacking you.
Yeah.
So that closed down, contracted feeling is the exact opposite of, these things are called mind expanding for a reason, right?
Right.
This
They
open,
expand.
expanded quality of experience that often is described when somebody takes a psychedelic. And so giving somebody a taste of that felt experience of expansion, where they lose that sense of self. Well, if they lose a sense of self, there's nobody there to be anxious. And there's a tremendous amount of freedom in that, where it's like, oh, this is possible. On top of that, this is where, mindfulness, and also, almost all of this, I don't study every single spiritual tradition, but in my very superficial exploration of the, commonalities of different spiritual traditions, there's they're all pointing at the same thing, which is letting go of that self, whether it's described as ego or small self or ego death, or you know um, letting the divine flow through us. All of that speaks to this widening experience. And even the poet Rumi, there's a poem, I will paraphrase because I tend to butcher poems, where he talks about, he's like, why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? Like living in these tangle of fear thinking. So he's talking about, like anxiety. He's like, when you can be expand and expand, or live into wider and wider circles of being, right? So he's already talking about the contrast between that contracted experience that comes from putting ourselves in jail with our fear thinking, and the possibility of expanding, where we drop that self-identity or the ego and just be. And this is what these practices help us experience. And, the psychedelics can give us a taste of that. But importantly, it's really important that we learn that that possibility is there, and we can actually be living into it any moment, right? So in any moment, we can either be contracting if we're caught up in anxiety, or we can be expanding if we're, tapping into that superpower of curiosity.
That's such a hard thing to communicate without a subtext of it's your fault. Because what so many people hearing this, and this won't be the first time they experience that if they have experienced it because they've lived in the world, is that by not being able to manage it or just get their shit together, it's as if the supposition is that they've got like this dashboard of on-off switches, and they're just choosing not to turn off or dial down the anxiety, and that's just not the case. Also, because I believe in nuance and dialectical thinking, I completely agree with all of what you're saying. I just want to make sure that in messaging this, I underscore that, yes, this can feel shaming, and it need not. I understand why it would, and it need not. The idea of expanding beyond our own experiences, and so much of mental health struggles is literally about this preoccupation with self. That's what happens with most mental health issues. We're not hyper focused on others. We're really caught up in ourselves, and there's an internal preoccupation that can look really selfish and and makes it so hard to look outside of ourselves to do this expanding. I will jokingly shortcut how I explain my profession, especially if I'm traveling abroad. People say, "What do you do for a living?" I'm not going to say I'm a licensed clinical social worker. Most people don't know what the hell that means. I say I'm a shrink. And some real smart people have said, "Why do you call it that? You expand people. You should say you're an expander." And I'm like, I hear you. That in and of itself requires a whole presentation to explain. So I just try to shortcut all of that.
Nice.
But it is very, very interesting. I'm curious to see where the study of psychedelics brings us.
Yeah, that
I
would be
think we're
very
living,
interesting.
with respect to that, I think we're living in an exciting moment in time.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
You've developed apps like Unwinding Anxiety. I would love for you to explain a little bit about this app.
The app is really based, and I detail this in the same named book, Unwinding Anxiety, where there over the last couple of decades we've identified this three-step process where people form habits and importantly can learn to unwind them. So whether it's anxiety or stress eating or whatever, we first have to recognize what the habit is, what the behavior is. And that's the first step. The second step, and I was alluding to this a little bit earlier, is really seeing how unrewarding the old habit is. And this is really important because a lot of people are very attached to worrying because they just think it's who they are. I remember there was a patient that was pilot testing our program at the beginning and wrote me an email saying, "I feel like this anxiety is deeply etched in my bones." I think that's how she put it. And so she was so identified with the anxiety, she couldn't imagine anything other than that. And so we have to start getting curious and ask, oh, is this me or is this a feeling? And more importantly, because we can get caught up in these existential questions, pragmatically, we can ask, what am I getting from worrying? Is it helping me at all?
Mm-hmm.
And what are the direct effects, right? Oh, it makes me feel more anxious. Well, being able to see that connection between anxiety driving worry, which feeds back and drives more anxiety, is really critical. And that's the first thing I have my patients do. So when I do an intake and get their history and all that, I send them home with the instructions just to map out these habit loops. Like, what's the behavior and what's the result of the behavior? And
Yeah.
I talk about a guy in my Unwinding Anxiety book. His name, pseudonym in the book is Dave, where I send him home to do that. And he comes back 2 weeks later. He was also 400 pounds. So had some health anxiety due to a bunch of health issues related to his weight. He comes back 2 weeks later, and the first thing he says to me is, "Hey, doc, I lost 14 pounds." And I'm like, we didn't talk about weight loss yet. And he said, my anxiety was driving me to eat fast food. And I realized that that was not helping with the anxiety. And it was actually making me more anxious. So he said he stopped. He went on to lose over 100 pounds. He's maintained that weight loss. I'd spoken to him a couple of weeks ago. He's like, "I lost 30 more pounds."
Wow.
So we can apply these methodologies to any unhealthy habit. The key is seeing how unrewarding the behavior is. So he said, oh, he didn't just think it, he knew it, he felt it, he experienced that the eating the fast food wasn't helping his anxiety. So he became disenchanted with it. And this taps into this critical brain pathway that says, okay, if something's rewarding, keep doing it. If it's not, stop. Right. So this is how we help people quit smoking, how we help people stop overeating. It's really that question. What am I getting from them? So that's the second step. And the third step is my favorite, which is, I call it finding the bigger, better offer. And that's where we, if our brain's going to do things that are rewarding, we give it something rewarding to do. So this is where curiosity comes in. And we say, okay, when you're feeling anxious, you could worry. Notice what that feels like and what you get from that. Or you could get curious about what those physical sensations are. And so, first off, what feels better? Worrying or being curious? Curiosity. It's a no-brainer, right? Curiosity feels
Right.
better. So already our brain's like, oh, I'd like more of that. And then we can get curious about the physical sensations. And we notice that these are not nearly as scary. They don't last as long. They aren't as strong as we think they are when we resist them or we run away from them. Because when we
Right.
resist or run, they're going to run after us. They're going to push back. What we resist
Mm-hmm.
persists. I'm sure you learned that, as well.
Yes.
So the key there is to do the opposite. It's like this Aikido move where instead of resisting, we open. Here's this opening again. We open to
Yeah.
our experience. One of my favorite sayings is the only way out is through.
Right.
So this is,
Sadly.
yeah. So if we open to our experience, we just give it all that space, it's going to just unwind on its own.
Yeah, Buddhism 101 in a way.
Yes.
Not to oversimplify it, but
No,
that's the cornerstone of Buddhism that like life is painful. It only becomes suffering when we resist it, when we
absolutely.
resist the pain. But you
Mhm.
can't avoid the pain. Life hurts.
Yeah.
So I want people to have access to this tool. Talk a little bit more about the app itself and how it works.
Sure. So I mentioned those 3 steps because the app takes about 10 minutes a day where people basically, get a lesson, 10 minutes, it gives them some exercises to practice, and they just, it's a sequential core of 30 days or 30
Mm-hmm.
modules. And then there are a bunch of theme weeks that people can use to bolster what they've learned. And the idea is to walk them through these 3 steps. We call these 3 gears. We use the
Mm-hmm.
analogy of a bicycle, because you can shift gears depending on what you need to do. And what we found, so, we developed the program, of course, as a scientist, I want to know if it works. And so we did a series of studies. Our first study was in anxious physicians because we figured, what's a really hard population to work with? Well, I know we as physicians are pains in the asses. So, we did a study with them, 57% reduction in clinically validated anxiety scores. We're like, okay, that's pretty good. But it was an open label trial. Who knows? Maybe they could have regressed. Maybe they all did psychedelics. Who knows? They didn't. But so we did a randomized controlled trial. This because we could get funding from the NIH once we had a signal.
Right.
And this is with generalized anxiety disorder. So it's like, okay, what's the hardest one to work with? And we got a 67% reduction in anxiety. So like, great.
That is fucking tremendous.
Yeah.
Compare that to how effective is the most effective anti-anxiety medication.
Yeah. And it's
Give
funny.
the stats to that,
Yeah.
just for people who might have missed that stat.
Yeah. So for medications, the number needed to treat is 5.2, which means, and the larger the number, the worse the result. So it's 1 in 5. With our study, it was 1.6. So it was almost, it was better than 1 in 2.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Do you absorb that? Like how incredible that is? How what a game change that is?
It's a good question. To me, it's kind of like, well, duh, if you do the mechanism, if you like get at the mechanism, of course something's going to work. But of course, you never know until you try it. So I have to say, it's very gratifying on a person by person basis when people come and say, I've been in therapy for 20 years and this is what really helped. Is not to belittle therapy, because there are a lot of great therapists
No.
out there.
But we're meant to be incorporating evidence-based tools,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
that's why some of us have a higher success rate than others. And so we should be working in tandem with these
Absolutely.
evidence-based tools. It's not one or the other.
That's the way I think of it. Is it makes us, you and me as therapists, it can
Look
make
like
us,
rock stars.
well, I think of it as making us bionic, right?
Okay.
So, because again, right, it's not about us. But the idea is, if we don't have to spend 20 sessions walking somebody through something, and we can
Right.
say, here's the idea, go read the book or download the app, and then come back to me next week. It's like it supercharges our work because like suddenly they've done a bunch of work in between sessions and now they're making all
Yes.
this great progress. And our job is to, us, and we also designed the app this way, is we're designed to be deleted, right? The better we can be as therapists, the
Yes, the
sooner
sooner they're
they
done with
can,
us.
yeah, they can fire us in a great,
Yes.
and everybody wins when they fire us, right? Because that opens us a space for somebody else that needs help, and they don't need us anymore. How gratifying is that?
Yeah. And so for my clients who are listening to this, grumbling that you have homework every day of your life, that's part of the reason why I'm trying to expedite my you terminating me.
Yeah.
Uh,
That's a good
so
sign.
how do you see technology fitting into the future of mental health treatment? We have, I'm so glad that your program is now a digital app. Um, we're seeing mental health apps of all kinds pop up, including therapy apps. How do you see the intersection of technology and mental health treatment?
Well, I think it has the possibility of greatness and big asterisk here because there are a lot of people that spin up apps or programs based on, that they're an entrepreneur or they're an engineer, but not a therapist. And so,
Correct. Don't have the credentials.
yeah. Yeah. And don't incorporate those people onto their teams because they're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I don't have time to do these
Mm-hmm.
studies because they take a long time. Well, guess what? If you don't do the studies or at least incorporate the evidence into your programs, a lot of people say, oh, this is science based. And to which I say, show me, because most of it they
Literally.
aren't. Yeah. So most of these programs, unfortunately, and people abandon them quickly, you know, which is evidence that there's no evidence, right? So these things don't really
Mm-hmm.
work. So people have to sift through this themselves to try to figure out. It's like disinformation. Well, it's misinformation because I don't think people generally do this, blatantly trying to just suck money from people. So it's really important that people find good evidence-based programs, and this is where folks like you and I come in, where we can say, well, there's this evidence base for this, this, and this, but not these other things. So it's important to get more evidence, and on top of that, I think and I'm even exploring this myself. It's going to be really interesting to see how the conversational agents, the large language models, and whatever the
Mm-hmm.
next generation of them looks like.
The
Uh,
AI.
yeah, where we can take, our evidence base and basically think of it as like a therapist in your pocket,
Mm-hmm.
where they are more interactive than, I've got 30 modules that are set, but we can take those and we can specifically train, our like a Dr. Judd bot, let's say,
Yep.
to be able to deliver a program in a different way than the more static programs that are currently delivered, even our own. And so
Mm-hmm.
we can build on our own evidence base and say, okay, what's the next generation going to look like? And I think that's becoming even more clear already.
What's the potential downside to that?
Well, I think like we talked about earlier, these are not meant to replace people. The upside is if they can make us bionic in the sense that we can have our practices expand to people, make them more affordable, make them more accessible, and just get to more people where that evidence base can get to more people. And, we can also safeguard them by making sure that there are people behind the bots that are monitoring the bots to make sure if somebody's really struggling, they get access to healthcare, which is, another thing that not everybody has access. But,
Mm-hmm.
we can set up the program. So the downside is if people, they only rely on it. Well, the downside that we've talked about is if you take something that's garbage, that could be harmful. And we've seen this already, teenagers committing suicide because the bot, says, "Oh, come be with me," and the teenager takes that literally.
Yes.
So we've already seen the downsides. We can safeguard against that if done well, if these things are built on evidence and also with clinicians supervising and backing these things up. So you can scale that a lot more than you can scale single individuals like you and me. We only have so much
Yeah.
time in the day. 4 to 7 clients is already a lot, and
Mm-hmm.
so this can be a way to hopefully help more people.
Yes. What I think this is me giving people the benefit of the doubt, but what I think happens with entrepreneurs or influencers is that they have a good experience with therapy or a therapist or a treatment. And when you're amazing at gymnastics, it looks really easy to replicate.
Mhm.
And so they over-index or under-index rather the amount of training that led to this moment where we can synthesize a complex problem into a couple of paragraphs and offer some evidence-based treatments. And they think they can just rinse and repeat this process that looks so easy to them because they've had a positive experience themselves. And then, I wind up doing trauma treatment on the clients that get harmed by that because they're seeing paraprofessionals or bots. I have not had that experience yet, where somebody has had to come to me but certainly, in the profession of, hey, let me help you with your trauma. I've overcome my own trauma. Here's my story. I can help you with your story. When I hope I never do, but if I ever need an oncologist, the question out of my mouth will never be, have you had cancer yourself? And have you overcome it? Because I just want to know, did you go to a good school and what is your success rate? And what would you tell me if I was your daughter, sister, wife, mother?
On top of that, I, as a physician, took an oath at the beginning of medical school, which I still remind myself of as much as possible, which is first do no harm, right? So I don't know any influencer that, kind of took an oath as part of their influencer profession.
Yeah.
And how about bots? I mean, hopefully they're being trained to do no harm. But
Right.
there's something very human about the intention of doing no harm.
Correct.
It's very different than a bot that's trained on a bunch of Reddit threads.
Right. Right. Agreed. And having ethics be taught to you and a standard of care along with that. But yeah, I completely agree. I want to circle back to anxiety for a second because I have a little quirk. I am someone who doesn't like feeling excitement. I really don't like to talk about upcoming trips or plans ahead of time, no matter how much I'm looking forward to it. And a shrink once told me it's because excitement and anxiety are sort of two sides of the same coin. On one side, you have excitement, and on the other side, you have anxiety, and that our nervous systems can't necessarily always tell the two apart. Is that true, or do I have
Yes.
more emotionally challenged areas of my life that warrant exploration that I'm aware of?
Well, I'm sure there are, but
You're wonderful.
No, I'm kidding. I mean, we all have that. But I'm glad that person pointed this out because it's subtle, and often people don't like to think of that because excitement is often it's categorized, if you look at the emotions, frameworks, as a positively valenced emotion.
I know. On the
Yeah.
Yale app, what is it? It
Oh,
used to be called Mood
the
Meter.
mood
Now it's
meter.
called
Yeah.
How I Feel or How I Am.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's categorized in a positive
Right.
color.
Right. And anxiety, not so much. What do they share? Well, if you blindfolded us around valence, right, positive or negative, and you just said, what does it feel like? Right. And said, okay, what's anxiety feel like? Well, it feels restless. What does excitement feel like? It feels restless. What does anxiety feel like? It feels like this contracted feeling. What does excitement feel like? It feels like this contracted feeling. What does anxiety focus on? The future. What does excitement focus on? The future.
I'm seeing the two
Yeah.
columns and ticking similar boxes. Yeah.
So I shouldn't say the only, but the primary difference is that one is negatively valenced and one is positively valenced. But if you cut out the valence, boy, those two look pretty similar.
I'm just back from a vacation, and so every person in my life was asking me leading up to it, "Are you excited to go on vacation?" And I was leaving just days after Thanksgiving. And I was like, "No, I'm really just trying to be in this moment. I'm not even in Thanksgiving hosting mode yet. I'm in this moment." And then on Thanksgiving, are you guys looking forward to going away? And I'm like, I'm really just enjoying your company right now. And part of it is my mindful practice because
Yeah.
like I do struggle with anxiety. It's not debilitating, thank God. I've had moments where it was, but they've been few and far between.
Mhm.
But I'm trying to get to the next level of my own internal work. And I really just want to be in this moment. And people just want me to future trip, man. And I'm just
Mm.
like, can I just be
Not going
here
there.
and now? Because
Yeah.
it doesn't feel good to me. It
Yeah.
doesn't.
Well, when people ask you those questions, it's not about you, it's about them.
Tell me more.
Well, you know, when, so, think back to the scenario. Somebody might be interested, somebody might be nervous, want to fill the space, or it might just be a habit. But all of that is based on them, right? Oh, I
Mm,
want to know what's going on with you. I might be nervous. I might want to fill the space. It's about me. It's not about you.
right. Yeah. I mean, if we could all operate with that understanding, which is 99% of the time the case, we would be a lot less uncomfortable in life
Mhm. Yeah.
because most things really aren't about us. Sage advice. Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Now that you've given me a tool or a new way to view that, what is one exercise that our listeners can use to lower their anxiety?
My favorite one, and I've outlined a bunch in the book, uh, and also in the app, but my favorite one is to just notice what that internal voice sounds like when we're worrying, as a way to help us have that awareness bell go off. And it tends to be some flavor of, oh no. All right. That's the first step. It's only two steps. First step is check to see if you're going, oh no, internally or out loud. And then put on your superpower cape of curiosity and go, oh, what's this feel like? Because we're flipping that switch from resisting or running away from or worrying to just being in the moment and being curious. Oh, what does this feel like? So that's it. Oh no to oh. And then every time there's an oh no, oh, till that becomes our new habit.
I
Rinse and
love
repeat.
that. Yeah, I love that. There is a term that you use. I forget if it's in the course or in the book. I've gone through both more times than I can count. Um, and I will link to both in the show notes of this episode. There's a word that you use. I think it's enchantment. Like
Mm,
the feeling that a child has when they're
mhm,
like wonder, like
mhm.
when they're like curious and they're just looking around. And we tend to lose that as adults, don't we?
We do. Yes. There's this assumption that we need to always know everything, which is completely ridiculous. You know, I always want to not know because then I can learn more.
Or enchantment feels so good to me personally.
Yeah.
That is something I would love to future trip on and imagine myself being enchanted at some future point, which I was on vacation for those of you who want to know. It was epic. What do you do to stay emotionally grounded and healthy?
Well, certainly mindfulness practice is helpful. And as part of that is just really seeing how much I can groove that habit of being curious, like every moment.
Wow. So even though your brain has shortcuts to answers for everything, I'm sure, uh, you try to stay curious and slow down as if you don't know the end of everybody's sentence or every plausible scenario that is out there. Is that right?
Yes, and I'd have to say it serves me very well as a psychiatrist because I don't know everybody's experience. And if I assume that I do, I am doing them a disservice. And guess what? It is a lot more interesting not to know than to assume that I know how this story is going to end. Boy, everybody wins.
This reminds me of an endeavor that we were told to do in graduate school because socially in the States, part of the way we communicate to each other, that we get each other, that we're attuned, that we're connected, attached, and understand each other, is to fill in each other's sentences, finish each other's sentences and fill in each other's blanks, which very early on, I mean, 0 to 3 months of a relationship is really, it's very rewarding. And then after that, it becomes so annoying. And what our professor in graduate school wanted us to do, because they wanted to untrain us from that propensity, because if you're a well-socialized being, you're going to assume that that's what you should do to communicate to someone, that you understand their experience. And the problem with doing that socially is that the people we are socially can be the people we are in the sessions with our clients. So long story short, the professor asked us to keep track of every time for a week, keep track of every time we're sure we know how a client is going to finish a thought. And don't open your mouth, but you're keeping score. And over the course of a week, we were wrong more than half the time. And it was such an important lesson because it taught us to shut up and to ask thought-provoking questions, because we don't know the why. We assume we know the why or the why not, and we don't. So I love that.
You were very fortunate to have this professor. What a great practice. And we can all do that, right?
We can just keep track. I mean, I tell my clients this all the time. I'm like, listen, you think you know what your partner is, what their reasoning is behind everything. And I'm telling you, we are wrong. Our assumptions are wrong. Just check in with them and ask them. They have the answer.
Absolutely.
They have the answers, you know? Dr. Jud, I have appreciated this time more than I can express to you. Where can people learn more about you, follow you?
I'm on Instagram, Dr. Jud. I think it's at Dr.Jud. My website's drjud.com. Those are the places to find me.
Beautiful. And I'll make sure that we link to both in the show notes. Thank you so much for the work that you do. We therapists need evidence-based tools, and you are remarkable. Thanks for your work.
Oh, well, thank you. It was my pleasure.
We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling is a Sterling Standard production. Editing and sound engineering is by Bart Migal. Our theme music is by Trending Music. Special thanks to Amanda Christiani and Preston Smith. If you know someone who struggles with anxiety, please share this episode with them. If you're unsure, send it to 3 friends, and one of them is likely to find it useful. We'll be back on Tuesday with another episode packed with the dating, relationship, and mental health hacks you have come to expect. References are always linked in the show notes.